Good evening and welcome to Education's Facebook Live discussion on the Union Budget 2025-26 in education hits and misses. Let me introduce my stellar cast of panelists. Suchindra Kumar is partner and sector leader for education at PwC, formerly with KPMG and EY. Suchindra's expertise spans school, higher and vocational education and also ed tech companies. Welcome, Suchindra. My next panelist is Namya Mahajan. Namya is an alumna of Harvard University, Harvard Business School. Namya is the co-founder of Rocket Learning, one of India's leading non-profits focused on using technology to catalyze early childhood education. Namya was formerly with McKinsey, managing director at Seva Federation. She was also a member of the National Curriculum Committee for Early Childhood Education. Welcome, Navya. Praveen Raju is president of ARISE, Alliance for Reinventing School Education, an autonomous chamber body lobby group for school education, working closely with FICCI and also founder director of the Suchitra Academy, Hyderabad. Praveen, welcome. Dr. Parth Shah, former professor of economics at Michigan University, USA. Dr. Parth is founder and president of the Center for Civil Society, one of India's leading top think tanks. He's also Dean and co-founder of the Indian School of Public Policy. A welcome, Parth. Dr. Chetan Singhai is the Dean, School of Law and Governance, Chanakya University, Bangalore. He was formerly Chief Consultant and Convener of the National Curriculum Framework, Ministry of Education, Government of India. Welcome, Chetan. Mansoor Khan is founder of the School of India Group of Schools, co-founder of the DPS schools in Bangalore and Mysore, an edupreneur and also secretary, All India Congress Committee, Kerala and Lakshadweep in charge. Welcome to all my panelists. Setting a quick context for our discussion. So this morning, Union Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented her record 8th budget against the backdrop of a slowing economy, 6.2% of GDP. Last when I checked last quarter, we had dipped to. So anyway, in her speech, she specifically mentioned that the achieving goal of Viksit Bharat includes 100% good quality school education. She identified 4 growth engines to achieve this, which included agriculture, MSMEs, investment in people and exports. So under investment in people head, she's made some announcements, which include enhancing budgets for the Saksham Anganwadi program, Poshan, setting up of 50,000 Atal tinkering labs, ensuring broadband connectivity in all government secondary schools, increasing seats in IITs and medical colleges, Center for Excellence in Artificial Intelligence for Education, 500 crore, plus setting up of 5 national centers of excellence for skilling. Now coming to the budget for education. So the budget for education has been increased from 1.2 lakh crore 2024-25 to 1.28 lakh crore this year. So this works out to roughly about 6.8, 6.9% higher than last year, which according to me barely covers inflation. As a percentage of GDP, I've just done some back of the envelope calculations. So the center's budget for provision for India's 500 million children and youth is actually less than 0.5% of GDP. So let's begin our discussion. So I'd like to come to Suchindra, you first. If you could quickly tell us and our audience, what do you think were the big hits and misses of budget 2025-26, specifically for education?
So, Sumaya, thanks for the great introduction. I think you summarized the budget well. Well, just as a starting remark, I think, adding a little bit to what you said, if I look at the entire budget for education, the central budget covers less than 25% of it. So overall spend on education is a sector in the country. The center spends, around 1.28. They plan to spend 1.28 lakh crores. The states do almost twice of this number, almost 1.5 times that of this number, which is the state budgets. But again, quite a bit of that budget also gets pulled in from the center. And finally, the private sector spend of the budget is almost 50% for education. And while the budget today has tried to do a lot of work around the government part of this entire ecosystem. The private part is something which is completely amiss today. There are no benefits per se, or no incentive for quality, or no incentive for any sort of investments into the space, which will lead. You cannot really have a situation where you are only investing and supporting one half of the system, which is the government system. For example, uh, the finance minister announced about 50,000 total tinkering labs to be set up. The announcement says it's going to be all in government school. It's a welcome step, definitely. All the support starts with the bottom of the pyramid, grassroots level students go. But at the same time, ideally, I would have loved if there was some announcements for the private space as well. We could talk more in depth on multiple things. So while somehow in one sentence, the heart is there definitely. Education and skilling was put up as one of the focus areas of the government. The actual allotment of budgets doesn't really add up to it. And we could get into specifics as we come along. The government has put their heart in the right place. I think a lot of work needs to be done to detail this out. The budget is always short. The government has to bring in private capital. The government has to bring in multilateral capital. Again, the finance minister has talked about multilateral capital in some of the schemes, but primarily focus on the government space. There also has not been too much of liberalization in any aspects for the private players. Forget the support part of it. And that might again be a hindrance to attract more capital into the sector.
Great. Thanks for those initial comments, Sachindra. Mansur, want to come to you and ask you what has been done?
I could not get your question. I could not hear.
Sorry, I said, what do you think about the budget and education? Do you think enough has been done for the education sector, or you expected something more?
See, actually, I agree that there's not much for the private education sector in this, but I feel this budget is an opportunity lost in the education sector. What could have been done? In fact, I don't see too much of increment in the budget for the education sector. It's more or less the same as what previously it used to be. So my what my take from all this is, like, for example, this is high on slogans, the budget, and maybe it'll be less on performance, because it's a welcome move, 500 crores being allotted to set up AI excellence centers and all that. But where we require funds, yes, one side is the government education system, one side is the private education system. Today, even if you see the government education system, before we get into this high excellence centers of AI and all that, what is required is the basic infusion of funds into the basic necessity of the schooling system. Because if you go into the government schools as well and see the infrastructure, without good infrastructure, not addressing the teacher training system or the dropout rates. For example, we may say that economic survey says that 93% enrollment is there in the primary level, but as you go to the secondary level, the dropout, it comes down to nearly 45 or odd percent. So what are we doing as a government to develop the basic infrastructure? Again, you talk about adding 10,000 additional medical seats. But where are you creating that infrastructure which will help that supply chain? And you are, again, 6,500 seats in IIT are welcome. But the basic issue is you are not addressing, you want to be a future superpower, but you're not addressing or giving enough money to the basic primary education infrastructure of the country. Let it be government or private. So I personally feel it's a lost opportunity. And yes, 50,000 adult tinkering labs for the government schools. But according to me, this is a welcome move, but there are many more important basic infrastructural issues where government requires to spend. And without getting in more money into the education sector, how do we expect to become a future superpower or Vishwaguru or whatever we call it? So I personally feel this is an opportunity lost.
Thanks, Mansoor. We'll come back to some of the points you raised on school education. Namya, coming to you, what's your take on the budget, and what do you think? Do you think also it's an opportunity lost, or you think it's hit the right buttons?
Yeah, so we actually work with the Anganwadi system, which is the world's largest daycare network, right? So it's the world's largest system supporting over 8 crore children, about 1 crore mothers. And, as we talk about school education being essential, primary schooling, the early childhood space is, in fact, even more, one could argue, impactful, right? Research suggests that, every rupee you spend is 7 rupees, generated for the GDP in the future. And most of that education actually happens through, the 1.4 million, 14 lakh Anganwadi centers across the country that are actually run and managed by the Women and Child Development Ministry. So this year, this was actually the first thing that was mentioned by the Honorable Finance Minister, the increase in allocation through the Poshan 2.0 and the Saksham Anganwadi schemes. So we do welcome that, the budget for the nutrition cost norms is being revised, right? I think that will impact those 8 crore children and their, nutritional status, enable them to learn more. But I think in the future, what we would be looking for is, an increased budget in the development and education of children under 6 as well. So we do now have, the welcome, there's a budgetary increase for NIPSID, which is the National Institute for Public Cooperation and Child Development. So that has seen sort of greater than 10% increase in budgetary allocation. We're seeing that there's a separate vertical under this for early childhood care and education. So, these are welcome developments that will go into, I'm sure, increasing the technical capacity of the government to do curriculum building, teacher training of the Anganwadi workers, improving the teaching and learning materials. But we are hoping that, as we move towards 2047 and India becoming a superpower, we will increase the focus and the funding for the children who will inherit that country, right? So what are we doing for children under 6?
Yes, so I'll come back to that. I've got some good figures on what really that increase means compared to last year. Yeah, we'll come back and speak more on that. Parth, coming to you, what do you think were the hits and misses? You're happy with what the finance minister has given education and what she's said and spoke?
I think having worked in the education policy sector for more than 20 years now, I think I have come to the point that you don't really expect much from the budget declarations, right? So there's a little bit of money here, a little bit of money there. And I agree with Namia that yes, the focus on Anganwadi and Poshan is certainly very important. And that's an important part of the budget contribution to increase funding. Though I think, as you are going to point out, is not really any substantial increase, given the also increase in the size of the population.
Yeah.
Right. So if you compare per capita allocation, it probably is lower than what it was earlier. So I think my sense is that, we had very high hope with this government when the NEP came in 2020. So the new education policy in 2020, we thought that, at least some of the good benchmarks were set up in that. And it may take a couple of years for government to figure out how to implement those sort of grand ideas, and certainly very good ideas, some of them. And we are hoping that at least last year of the previous term of the Prime Minister, and certainly now in this term, we would see a lot more action on the NEP. Right? So except for a couple of sort of foundational focus, there is not really much change at all. Right? So as you know, at the Indian School of Public Policy, we run a 1-year program in the graduate program in public policy or postgraduate program, which is not recognized by UGC, despite the fact that a lot of noise was made in the NEP that we will open up the sector in higher education, particularly where the customers are very informed by and large, they can make choices, and we should leave it to the customers and the institutions to figure out what's the best combination of courses, duration of courses that's appropriate for specific professions, right? So despite all of that discussion, and which is why actually we started 1-year program, because we think 1 year is a good enough program. But there is no discussion at all. Nothing really has changed from the UGC side. Nothing has changed in the AICTE, right? So I think higher education, particularly area that I'm currently working in directly, right? I don't really see much change at all. And it's really disappointing that despite all the discussion around NEP and the effort, energy of some of the people also on this panel, right, has gone into it, we don't really see much focus at all on those things. It's just tinkering around the margin that you keep seeing budget after budget, right? So I think given the fact that education is the key demographic challenge, right? And that everyone agrees with that, including the government. Despite all of that understanding and economic survey talking about deregulation being the key focus area, you have nothing happening in the social sector at all along those lines.
Yeah. We'll come back on that, deregulation and liberalization point, which you very validly raised. We'll come back to that. Praveen, coming to you and asking you your, initial comments on the budget. What did you think about it?
Yeah, thanks, Sumya. The budget for school education at least has been a significant jump in terms of percentage. We had about, I think, 16.5%, close to from 67,000, close to about 78,000 crores.
About 78,000, 572.
And the Anganwadi and portion, really, it's a very welcome thing that is happening. I really hope the implementation goes very well and the outcomes are reached. What I'm really bullish on is the AI Center for Excellence. So that is something which probably, we can leapfrog the traditional way of teaching with augmenting with AI. I don't know how to solve it, but I think the technology holds a lot of promise. Leveraging technology, I think we should be able to, get some things out of it, like how we leapfrogged the traditional landline telephones, with mobile phones. Is there an opportunity there? I think we need to spend a lot of time around that. And also in the ASA survey, the children's ability to operate cell phones and finding YouTube videos has seen a significant rise. So I'm sure, the usage of AI and, teaching tools should be able to help. So I think that's something which I'm very bullish on. So the thing that needs to be, as Suchindra mentioned, that private has completely been ignored, not mentioned. The contribution of private educators is also not recognized. And also not as well promoted as it should be. So we, if you take the international average, 13% of the children go to private schools versus, if you remove India from the equation, it's only 7%. Here we are, roughly about 50%, a few percentage points instead of that side. Yeah. So I think have we come to a point where we should discuss things about DBT, direct benefit transfer, options, or public-private partnership models where there's a lot of real estate that can be unlocked, the value of that can be unlocked. And also, is there a case for bringing in low-cost capital? So today, the private sector and government together, it also is not enough to bring about meaningful change in the education system. So can we in some way leverage low-cost capital that can be brought in from outside, pension funds and things like that, sovereign funds? Is that the case? So these are questions that we need to start discussing, debating, and also the government needs to look at these for us to become a nation where everybody is educated and educated well.
Thanks, Praveen. We'll come back to that. If we can open, especially higher as well as even school education sector, you're saying to, more private capital and private investment. Chetan, your quick comments, please, on what did you think about the budget? What were its hits and misses?
Yeah, well, I think one initial preamble that I would like to set for this two perspectives. I think we need to also acknowledge the fact that the policy, when it sets the vision, it kind of provides direction to see what are the priority areas. So, for example, skilling is something that is something which has been accounted for in this budget, which is a cross-cutting recommendation of the national education policy, and which is also getting reflected in the national curriculum framework in its own form and shapes and levels of learning. So, skilling is something which is a major sort of emphasis that one can see, and with NEP, there's also the Viksit Bharat perspective, which has been brought into this idea of skilling. Because in the NEP sections on skilling, uh, rather quite rhetorically, it was been brought in that the demographic dividend would turn into liability if not accounted for. And then hence the National Center for Excellence for Skilling is definitely a good value add to be thoughtful about and see how that will further facilitate the other recommendation of NEP, the multiple entry exit. So once the student exit in higher education, particularly, will do what? The skilling is critical. That's the gap they should fill in. So this is an example I'm trying to put forth as one point to take into account that we have to read the provisions of the NEP and the NCF and the budgetary allocations as a whole, wherever it is possible. Having said that, of course, there are a lot of misses. If this is one among many others that the co-panelist rightly said so, the research fellowship is definitely another value add to start with, but with certain aspects, which I'll come to the second part of discussion. But in terms of misses, I strongly feel that um, the notion of expansion in higher education that the NEP strongly recommends with the IITs and medical seats being increased will not suffice, because the goal of achieving 100% gross enrollment ratio by 2030, which is too very, very short in terms of the strategy and the goal, which is 4 years. Right now, we are at 30% GER. So that is where I think there's a very, very serious miss one could think of. The second important miss I feel is the how to account for public-private partnership in this initiatives or more. The other areas that have been missed also, but even the ones which have been highlighted, how the PPP can become central. And this idea of PPP, I'm sure Mr. Parsha is the right person to also emphasize on, because he's done so much work on it. But how do we do this? The budget should give direction, because all of that will finally come to the document in order to make this happen. And that is something which is miss that one can look at. And the last point is, I would say, in terms of miss, the food and nutrition component at the school level. Because one important aspect that we all have seen in the last maybe 4.5, 5 years is, for the first time, we are seeing education in a continuum, whether it is because of the NEP or vice versa, whatever it could be, or the budget. But we are seeing education as a continuum. So whatever happens in FLN will have its implications for higher education. So hence, I think more allocation, more seriousness towards food and nutrition. In fact, the draft NEP in the last section, annexure, clearly states that, for instance, breakfast should be also something should be provided. Because that's a very important value add for the child at that age, and it goes a long way. But right now, it is still in that PPP model in terms of how it is provided. But maybe that's something could have been given more and more weightage and clarity in terms of the implementation. So I'll come back to the other points, but these are my initial thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. I think everyone's made some very valid observations. Now we'll go into the specifics. Suchindra, I want to come back to you and just highlight some figures for you. Skilling has been a very big focus of this government. In fact, last year it was, one of the, in July when she presented her budget, one of her focus areas was skilling and generating employment and it became kind of center for focus, including the internship scheme, etc. Now, if you look at this year, substantially, in fact, the Skill Development Ministry's budget has been doubled from 3,300 to 6,100 crores. But unfortunately, given even the strides which we are making in this entire skilling, government having put its, focus on skilling, less than 5% of our workforce still has, received formal vocational training. So that's like quite a, it's a shocking figure.
Well, it is. And in fact, the budget that was presented today talks a lot about it. It's in bits and pieces. So while they've talked about the budget for the skill ministry, I think they have quite a few, nice things across the budget. So one, in the Ministry of Education piece, the budget for apprenticeship scheme. There's something called as National Apprenticeship Training Scheme, which is independent of the PM internship scheme, which was launched last year. The budget has almost been increased by 57%. So last year they did 4.5 lakh paid apprenticeships among some of the best companies. This number has now been increased to around 10 lakh. And the budget for this is around 1178 crores. Now, that's one area, for example. The budget also talks about something called as the Rural Resilient Scheme. That's one of the focus areas of the government. And under that, they're talking about skilling for agriculture, skilling for leather industry, skilling for fisheries, in which case you are getting relevant skills. That 5% number is really important because, traditionally there's been a mismatch in the availability of skill training versus what jobs are available. So I could probably train somebody in a village in plumbing, for example, but there are no plumbing jobs in the village. So the person has to move to the city, in which case, sustaining himself for that job in the city, probably his living costs go 3x and 4x. And we've done enough studies to kind of talk about this. The focus is in situ skilling and in situ employment, which in my view is a very, very positive development. Also, there's a focus again, in a different section in the budget where it talks about entrepreneurship, right? And entrepreneurship again is one massive area that we lack when it comes to the education system. We are always trying to create, job seekers than people who could really create jobs for others. So I believe that focus of putting in 10,000 crores of seed capital in a fund of funds to promote, uh, you know, entrepreneurship is a very welcome move. And, in my view, the school education system and the higher education system both should plug into it to create more employment.
Thanks, Suchindra, for those points on skills education. I think you've highlighted some, very, very good points which were perhaps hidden in, somewhere in the budget, especially about the apprenticeship program. Mansoor, I want to come to you and ask you, the latest UDICE report also is out. And though, some improvements have been made in infrastructure in school education in terms of, toilets, drinking water facilities, but to be ready for the future, for the AI age, for the digital age, etc. If you look at the numbers where, say, for example, computers, internet connectivity is concerned, 50 to 53% of schools in India still don't provide computers or internet connectivity. And even when you look at ACER learning outcomes, there are some marginal improvements, but still 51.2% of class 5 children can't read class 2 texts. So here the finance minister talks about, Viksit Bharat, and quoting her, she says that for this, one of the things that's required is provision of 100% good quality education. So how is that going to happen if you don't address the, foundational, which is school education? How can you achieve that? There's a kind of disconnect between these two.
See, exactly what you're saying, because when the welcome moves are like, okay, you are going for AI in schools, Atal Tinkering Labs, but your basic infrastructure, we talk about Viksit Bharat, but you need to walk the talk. For this, what you need? You need more funds into this education system, where in fact, if you see the last budget and now, you have there is a slight reduction on the allocation to education. So when you talk, and this has been a government which has been in power for last 10 years, and this is the finance minister's 8th budget. And if you want, you bought in the NEP, if you want a serious implementation on NEP, you need to have a plan. You need to, yes, it is a challenging task to allocate more funds, but for us, for India to be a real developed nation and a superpower without addressing the basic infrastructure needs, everything else, AI, Atal Tinkering Lab, everything will follow later. But even for a children to have computer literacy, you should have proper computers, you should have tablets, you should have proper training. And we need, there is, you need to see, look into us. Maybe you may cut the budget from some other sector, and at least in the media, there should be a short-term, medium-term, and long-term planning of the government for what will be the budgetary allocations. And if we are not, we are if you're not able to address these things at the primary education level, so what are we going to expect as we go forward? So what numbers you all are seeing, there may be slight improvement, but for a country like India, it just doesn't require slight improvement. It needs a drastic improvement if you want to achieve what we are planning to do or what trying to do. So successive governments, I just don't want to be telling that only this government, but as a country, we have somewhere failed the education funding into the education system. Though we may have had a lot of challenges, but if you really intend to make India into a developed country, Vision 2047 and all that, there is no other choice but to allocate more funds to let it be primary or higher education. You have to allot funds. The basic idea is more funding is required into this sector.
Thanks, Mansoor, because I don't think so. We have, I was just looking at the economic survey, which says that still center plus states spending on as a percent of GDP is still in the 3 and 3.5% rut. We haven't gone to what NEP 2020 said and what Qatari Commission said in 1967, that it needs to be 6% of GDP. That still hasn't happened. Government spending, I'm talking about, not adding the private sector spending. Namya, I want to come to you. And Namya, I'm going to ask you this. Saksham Anganwadi and PM Poshan, for, the first time, I think the finance minister specially mentioned these two in her budget speech. So I've dug out, the budget documents, and I've seen what the increase is. So this year, these two programs have got a combined investment of 21,960 crores. And last year it was 20,070 crores, which is roughly about an increase of about 8%. But I've done some quick calculations. This works out roughly to about 1,230 rupees per child per year for the 1.34 million Anganwadis. Okay, so according to me, this amount annually barely, can't even say it covers nutrition. I think this barely about covers nutrition. Forget about early childhood education and foundational literacy, which is such an important part of NEP 2020. NEP 2020, in fact, has restructured the 10+2 system to integrate 5 years of foundational learning. How are you going to do this within this little budget, which is like 1,300 rupees per child per year?
Yeah, so you're right that the allocation sort of, sounds small, and it is small compared to also the school education. So the per child school education budget is close to 5 times of this, right? And, there is always the question of when the brain development gains are actually more in the early years, then why do we see this discrepancy in what you invest in a 5-year-old versus a 6-year-old, right? When the 5-year-old's brain is developing faster. So I think this is definitely an area that sort of, we need to invest more in. I will say that compared to the rest of the developing world, we are still, I would say, the leaders, right? Because we have a massive, system of infrastructure that's already built. We have, Anganwadi workers, Anganwadi helpers who are in place. So there are possibilities to increase and improve education even within the existing budgets, right? So I think there is sort of, there was a new curriculum that was rolled out for the 3 to 6-year-olds called Adharshila. There was a, Navchetna, the first curriculum framework for children between births to 3. So these were rolled out. The Poshan Tracker now has content aimed at the Anganwadi worker that she can use in her center every day. The portion tracker, there are a wealth of other improvements that can be done that may not require massive cost outlays, right? So I think there is sort of, given that there is this vast infrastructure already available, I would hope that the focus this year is to sort of make these sort of, costless improvements and to continue to do, to pilot certain improvements, right? Whether those are, in better capacity building, whether those are in, better teaching and learning materials.
Do you
Right?
think a more push should have been made for then public-private partnerships, especially in the early childhood education sector, since the government is, not spending enough there?
Yeah, so there is definitely space for private partnerships. I believe the government is quite open to getting support from, both at the national and the state level. There is a lot of collaboration with civil society, with other partners. So I think those, are aspects which are happening. The universal education does need to be a focus, and that will have to happen through the Anganwadi centers. I believe that, the most marginalized, most vulnerable children will continue to be enrolled in the Anganwadi system. That's something that Asar also tells us. So the investment definitely needs to improve, and it needs to get much closer, in fact, right? So in most developed countries and even in developing countries, the pre-primary education budget is at least 10% of the education budget, whereas we are hovering closer to the 6 to 8% mark. So I think there is definitely room to grow in that. But the hope is that this year we will focus a lot on those capacity building, those low-cost interventions that will improve learning. And we'll, hopefully come back next year with a much more positive story on the investment in the early childhood years.
Thanks, Namya, for that very positive outlook. Partha, I want to come to you and ask you about if not money, do you think the finance minister should have made some broad announcement to liberalize and deregulate the education sector, especially higher education?
Absolutely, that was really the focus of NEP was, right? And I was just looking at the economic survey, which has been focusing on deregulation. So I thought maybe they would also talk about deregulation in the social sector, which is how the chapter has been written. So just the summary in the preface, it says this chapter on social sector last year focused on impact of screen time and ultra processed foods on children. That was what they focused on last year. Chapter this year examines the impact of work culture, lifestyle, and eating habits on mental health. So that's really what the economic survey says about what they are doing in the chapter on social sector, right? There's really, despite the fact that general tenor of the survey is on deregulation, there's nothing really about deregulation in the social sector, right? So it's quite surprising that even the economic survey, which is becoming more of a policy document as opposed to the budget nowadays, the budget is largely about the numbers of money being put on the table. You don't really see a focus there either on deregulation. And I think there is, of course, a lot has been done, research and debated about what kind of deregulation we need, right? And I think that's one basic thing about autonomy. And the government had given more autonomy to IITs and IIMs, right? Even their own institutions, they took it back from them, right? Just because certain things did not go their way, right? So I think understanding that autonomy is not just a fault of the people to whom you're giving autonomy, often is a faulty design through which you are giving autonomy, right? So the burden of in a sense, is on the government to figure out how best to design a system that gives autonomy to the institutions of higher learning, and at the same time holds them to account for better performance, for financial management, right? And instead of thinking along those lines, they are simply taking away the autonomy back from wherever it was given to IITs and IIMs, right? And of course, there is no discussion about giving more autonomy to private sector, right? So private sector still lives under license permit quota Raj, which was the biggest hurdle we had for the industrial sector. So I think education sector broadly needs that kind of rethinking about role of the state, role of the market, particularly when you have a half of the children in the country going to private schools, right? I
And
think
in
that's
higher
really,
education, that figure is almost 70%, Parth. In higher education, that figure is
yes,
70%.
yeah. And I think that requires a different way of thinking about private sector. It's not us versus them, which is still how government thinks about private sector, right? And I think talking about non-profit and civil society, of course, I'm part of that community. But I also find that within the civil society, much of the collaboration, most of the resources go into the government schools. While we know very well that there are same poor parents from the same locality are sending their children to budget private schools, right? And so if your concern is about improving the standard of learning of all children, and which hopefully is the concern of the government, right? Then you need to work with both the low-fee private schools and government schools together, right? Not just from the government side, but also from the civil society side. And I think there is also this bias within the civil society that I see, increasing bias, that private schools are not to be touched. Somehow they are beyond approach, and therefore only place we see to focus on is government schools.
No, I think you've raised some very valid point about, that the license permit quota Raj is still very much alive and kicking in education, whether it's school or higher education. Praveen, coming to you quickly, did you also, I want you to, take forward what Parth said, especially since, at Arise, one of your missions is to bring the private sector into, the national focus arena and to help government, as it were, achieve the goal of inclusive education. So do you think that, some broad policy announcement should have been made to liberalize the school education sector?
Absolutely. I think we've been sitting around budget after budget, year on year, talking about improvement in education and the kind of money that is spent. I know, statistics in Telangana, we spent about 70 to 80,000 rupees to educate one child a year. And that does not include the volunteers who fill in as teachers, the cost of that. It doesn't include the infrastructure cost. It doesn't include the administration cost. And whereas the learning outcomes, I'm not suggesting that, budget private schools are any, great or anything, but the similar learning outcomes they're able to give at a cost of 25,000 rupees or 30,000 rupees. So is it, should we have the debate? Should we open it up and say that, okay, this is what is happening and this is where we have failed, if I may use the word failed in as since independence. And the statistic which I gave you earlier, so many of our children are in private schools because there has been a necessity for lack of good government schools where the private schools have come up. And instead of pouring good money or expensive money to an educated child, can we look at options like DBT may not be the only solution, but can we look at something like that? Can we look at something on bringing in foreign investment itself? We need large investments in schools. Can we do some public-private partnership models? So what works, we don't know, but I think the dialogue should be there and the government should look at options which can really help us.
Thanks, Praveen. Chetan, coming to you now, and specifically, I wanted to ask you about one of the focus of NEP 2020 has been first of all increasing enrollment in the higher education sector, and second, also pushing R&D. In fact, it looks at universities as transforming into multidisciplinary research universities, and some 10,000 scholarships have been set up for research. And I think there's also been a proposal, if I'm not wrong, to give 20,000 crore to the private sector for R&D. So do you think these are good developments, or the higher education sector, like Parth said earlier, needs also an overall push to deregulation to meet that 100% GR target?
Yeah. In fact, in one of the occasions, I've heard a senior education is saying, very interesting what we're discussing on that. We liberated Lakshmi in 1991, but Saraswati is yet to be liberated. So I think that's the whole sort of thematic issue that one has to grapple with 68% of higher education institutions taking share of the total enrollment of 49% roughly. What we see is that there are certain provisions which are there in NEP, like the Higher Education Commission of India, which could make some change in the way we are looking at the regulation today. But the key point there is trust and public disclosure. That's something becomes critical. So that's largely rooted in the institutions frame rather than at a systemic level. So this whole idea of deregulation is embedded. It is not explicit in this notion of public disclosure and trust and transparency is what is the spirit. That's why in NEP it's called light but tight regulatory system. At least one thing is that we are able to come out of standardized uniform regulatory framework to a differentiated regulatory framework. That's one move. But I think whether it needs financial backup from the budget is another question, because we are missing out on another actor here is the state government. Because education is the concurrent list of the constitution and the subjects which demand both state and center. So that adds to your earlier second question, that the role of the state in R&D is very, very critical. And what happens largely is they depend on DST and many other DBT and many other such agencies to engage with. That's why the idea of National Research Foundation came in, which is the now ANRF, Anusandhan National Research Foundation. So now there, what we see is reform in the processes, operationals. One is allocation, other is bringing, because earlier the private sector was not eligible to apply for certain funds because they're largely driven towards the IITs or the government institutions. So now that particular aspect has been taken out. So even if you're a new university, a 1-year-old to a 100-year-old university, you're eligible to apply for funds. And that is where the missing actor, the state also becomes critical, because they depend on this set of resources coming from the central, that is the budgetary thing. That's why it appears to be very less. And hence I would go to Namya's comment of comparing with other countries' share and your concern that we are not able to achieve the Kothari Commission's vision of 6% share of GDP. What we need to shift is maybe to sort of take an argument that instead of share of GDP, can we say percentage share of public expenditure? Because there are at least 9 ministries who indirectly spend on education, in addition to education. So if you say take the share of that, it comes to close to 20%, which is what NEP's recommendation was. So hence, I think the shift in looking at, for example, the Ministry of Electronics, METI, there is an increase to 48.6% share of budget from last year to this year. So now the AI component, the skilling component, many things will be coming from there, for instance. Then the Minister of Skill Development, for instance, Minister of Entrepreneurship and Skill Development, for instance. So how do we see this in a holistic way? The last point for higher education I would like to bring is that the miss that I feel, which is very, very critical miss, is the type 1, type 2, type 3 universities that, as you were mentioning, multidisciplinary university. By 2035, we are now supposed to be repositioning our higher education institutions to these 3 types. I'm not seeing anything coming on that front, right? Because unless the government institution starts taking lead, there is not much legitimacy and trust from the private sector also to move to that direction. It really has a lot of it has a very great value in shaping those type 1, type 2, type 3, because there's a clarity for both the actor inside the institution and the output that one can expect from these kind of institutions. But with IITs coming in, great, but are we going to that direction? Because it's sort of not aligning with the provisions. So I think that's where we are looking at this kind of
Actually, coming to that point, Chetan, one of the primary things of NEP 2020, which it says in higher education reform, is getting rid of these universities affiliating massive colleges. Like Mumbai University has 800 to 900 colleges. No reform has taken place in that sector at all. Bangalore
Yes.
University
Yeah.
still 300, 400, even after the bifurcation, we have 300, 400 colleges affiliated. So there's a lot of, in fact, a lot of reform which has been spoken about in NEP 2020, whether it's in school or higher education, it's still, not happened. And I think, we're getting into unnecessary controversies like the recent UGC draft on VC appointments, etc., when they better issues to address in the NEP 2020.
Yeah,
But
so that's what the point on the, I'll just make a quick intervention. That's the point of the center-state relation. That is one
yeah.
part. The other is the type 3, that is autonomous. When we talked about autonomy, autonomous college, why are they not becoming autonomous college? In fact, on the ground zero, what we see, affiliating colleges are not willing to become autonomous, even if you want to offer them, because the umbilical cord is the affiliating fee that they get from the colleges for their existence. The university is not willing to give up affiliating, even if they want to be so advised, or they are eligible to become autonomous with NAC grade and all, but they're not willing to. Hence, this allocation becomes very critical. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Anyway, what I'd like, I think we're almost finishing our 1 hour slot time. But what I want each one of you to quickly, before I sum up, is each one of you all to quickly tell me that one thing which you thought, the budget absolutely didn't cover and you would have liked to see. Suchindra, going with you.
I believe just one major area, infrastructure, everything, all the hard infrastructure could be budgeted for. You could look at PPP, you could do whatever. I think the big miss is focus on the entire educator training. There are schemes which existed. There is a scheme called Nishtha. There is, Madan Mohan Malviya teacher training mission. For higher education, early childhood education, we simply have no ecosystem of teachers, if you realize, and the budget is completely silent on it. So you could do all the polishing that you could, but the software or the operating system is the teacher. And I think that's one area that the budget misses out.
I agree, completely agree. Mansoor, to you, that one thing you would have liked to see and it's not in there?
See, I would have liked the government, instead of making flashy announcements, have a fair, inclusive, and practical education policy which has a real impact on the ground. And also, focusing on IITs is fine, but there should have been a focus on public universities and colleges as well for funding. So I think these are the issues that I would have liked to the government to address, and I think they missed on it.
Thanks, Mansoor. Namya, to you?
Yeah, I would have loved to see a focus on birth to 3 in this whole ecosystem, on early childhood stimulation, because this is an age where really sort of women's economic labor force participation, the future of education in the country, the future of health in the country really comes together. So when we talk about women-led development, when we talk about, a country in 2047 that will be a global superpower, I don't think we can miss out on India's youngest citizens. So hopefully next year we will see that focus.
Thanks, Namya. I think that was a very important, 0 to 3, which you mentioned, so closely related with the women's participation in the labor force, which has gone down quite a lot in India after COVID. Parth, to you, that one thing which the budget you'd have liked to see in the budget?
I think one simple thing, I think if we can do, the government believes that they are responsible for all children of India and not just those who go to government building called government school, right, or government college. I think once we begin to see that as a holistic picture, as opposed to contrasting private schools and government schools, private colleges and government colleges, I think we are losing so much time in that battle. And the government needs to think really seriously about how do they be accountable for all children of India, not only one part of them.
So you'd have seen more inclusive education. Praveen, to you?
Yeah, I totally echo what Parth just said. I think its time has come. The private and also government needs to work together and sit together and arrive at solutions for the future of India. Otherwise, 2047 will remain a dream.
Chetan, to you?
the major sort of aspiration that I always had and continue to have is to focus on dedicated funding for social science research. It's still not coming. It's high time that one has to think about it. And I think it's still definitely missing point.
Thank you to all my distinguished panelists. I think we've had a great debate, various perspectives, starting from early childhood to school to higher and to skills education. But I think just to summarize, I think overall, everyone is happy but not happy with the budget. It could have done much more. If not put in more money, could have come in with that big bang, perhaps deregulation, liberalization, brought in more private money to boost upgradation of Indian education across the board, whether it's government or private. In education world for the past almost 10 to 15 years, we've been presenting every year a supplementary budget for education where we give a roadmap. We say, yes, there is money within the government establishment to provide for social sector spending, which is health and education. We've given a roadmap where we believe by cutting down on establishment expenditure, cutting down on non-merit subsidies, and perhaps disinvesting in PSCs, which the BJP government about 10, 15 years ago had a plan, which it has, now let go. By doing all this, you can, release almost 7 to 8 lakh crore for investment in education. I think most importantly, we need more debates. We need, people like yourself to build the pressure of public opinion on government to increase spending, not just increase spending, but also overall policy reform. Because not just money, we need policy reform. We need more investment in the software, like Suchindra said, teacher development. That's something which is completely missing, whether it's the training the Anganwadi teacher or the school teacher or the secondary school teacher, which is evident in the ACER report, learning outcomes, where still 50% of children can't read. Class 5 children can't read class 2 text. This is something unacceptable. We need to put education right on the #1 priority on our national agenda, because without addressing education, we cannot achieve the goal of Viksit Bharat, or 30 trillion GDP economy in 2047, when we'll be celebrating our 100th year of independence. Thank you very much. We've had a great debate. Thank you all, Suchindra, Praveen, Namya, Chetan, Parth, and Mansoor for joining. Let's continue this debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.